Hello, this is the Culture Genie, and today we are going to discuss how armies were recruited during the early caliphates. I'm speaking about the period of the 17th century to the 13th century. Before we begin, it's important to know that there did not exist a standardized army in this period of time, and the composition of forces and their structures could differ greatly from place to place and time to time. Remember, this is a rather long period of 6 centuries in the Islamic world. A world which stretches from Spain in the west to India in the east. Thus what we are discussing here is a huge territory and huge span of time, with many local variations and some exceptions. But that said, this video will present a generalized view about the armies of the various political entities that existed during this period. First are the caliphal troops. These had many names. Muharibun lil Khalifati, the warriors for the caliph. Al-Mujannadun lil Khalifati, the recruits or soldiers for the caliph. In any case, these are the warriors and soldiers commanded and paid directly by the caliph, or by a proxy that the caliph has assigned to work in his stead, commanding the army and leading troops, such as a local amir or commander or a sultan, a local leader. What distinguishes these soldiers from other types of troops in the armies of the early Islamic period is that these are paid professional soldiers on a permanent basis. They are paid because the Islamic Sharia has traditionally forbade forced conscription of free men. You could not force a free man to fight against his will without compensation. So the caliph or any other Islamic leader during this time was pretty much forced to have a paid standing force if he wanted to have an army that only answered to him. In any case, these were usually actually a minority of the forces, and mostly were around 20% or a fifth of the forces in an army, if they were present at all, and not fighting through a proxy, as was the most common case, as most battles during this period are actually rather small-scale skirmishes and not large-scale armies clashing with several thousands of men. This is actually historically quite common to only have a very small force of paid professional soldiers, historically. Larger professional armies, like the Romans before the Arabs, did not start to become more used until the late medieval and Renaissance time in Europe and the Middle East. And it's pretty much only China during this period that has any form of larger scale professional army, as having paid permanent troops was costly, as you had to train them, equip them and pay their salaries on a permanent basis to keep them around. And the caliphal office source of income to pay these troops was through tax money, mainly collected from the Kharaj tax and the Jizya, which were taxes that were levied upon non-Muslim subjects. And the later we go in time in this period, the more people convert from their non-Islamic religions into various versions of Islam, and thus the tax revenue decreases for the caliph and other Muslim rulers. So the amount of paid troops belonging to the centralized power of the various political entities of this period decreases, and various Islamic leaders that already had to rely upon other types of forces, as their paid professional corps of troops was always a minority in the beginning, became even more dependent on other types of troops later, which leads us into the second type of troops who could fight in an Islamic army. And these are the Al-Mutatawi'un, or free volunteers, who signed up to fight in various armies temporarily, and usually not more than for a single campaign or season, either for faith or for promises of booty, slaves or riches, or even land rights afterwards. So in many cases these so-called free volunteers are actually not that free. These types of troops were more common in the early beginnings of the Islamic Arab conquests during the early period, as the promise of conquest and riches made many free volunteers join in exchange for a chance to get booty and loot from the conquest. And these volunteers became later less present when it becomes mostly defensive wars on the borders of the Islamic domain, or wars against other Muslim targets where it is harder to justify plundering or slavery, as Islam forbids enslaving other Muslims, and thus booty is not as common. Though there was usually always the excuse with those Muslims not being correct believers and thus legitimate targets for plundering and slavery. Though this is another subject to discuss in another video. In any case, the advantage to volunteers are that they are free, or at least free until you actually earn some booty that has to be divided. But even then, they could be considered one of the more cost-effective types of troops, as they were pretty much free until you actually won. However, they had a very large problem that always plagued these types of troops. As many of them joined due to reasons of faith, they had problems usually with being fanatics, and fanaticism and thus disloyalty to any leader that was perceived to be unfaithful was not uncommon. Mutiny and internal rebellion was not that uncommon among these types of troops. And you see this from the very beginning of the Islamic age, with, for example, Ali, the fourth caliph in Islam, being killed by the Khawarij, who could be considered to have been a faction of fanatic volunteers that had deemed Ali to have deviated from the true path of the faith. Thus there was always the risk of rebellions being caused by fanaticism or perceived lack of virtue and piety in the behavior of the ruler. So there did exist a sort of lack of control, as many of these volunteers fought for faith reasons rather than material reasons. And speaking about material reasons, now we are getting to the next type of troop. Mercenaries, or Al-Murtaziquun, literally those that earn their living. These are sometimes hard to distinguish from general soldiers, as the name literally means those that earns pay. In modern Arabic, this word just means mercenaries. However, in the past it could also refer to any sort of soldier that earned pay. So there was and could be some overlap between these soldiers and the paid centralized troops of the various Islamic political entities that existed. However, the difference between these soldiers and the centralized soldiers is that they are paid both. However, the mercenaries are temporary soldiers and warriors that were guaranteed payment dependent upon how long of a time they spend out in the field, in addition to the standard fare of being guaranteed a part of the spoils after a campaign, if there are any. These mercenaries could have all sorts of backgrounds, from highly professional troops to pretty much just desperate men and bandits that sought pay. And unlike the centralized armies, and more like the volunteers, they weren't a uniform force, and the control of them was questionable sometimes, as their allegiance was usually to the highest bidder or the less likely side to die, and those could change quickly, meaning that these sorts of troops weren't always that dependable. And they could be very costly too, especially when things were dragging on and a campaign took longer than expected, as they would still demand payment for the work done, even if it had not resulted in positive victories. Thus, they had the same problems of cost as the more permanent paid soldiers, and the caliph or the centralized ruler had even less control over them. Speaking about lack of control of troops, the next type of troops are the auxiliary troops from the various allies, or the Al-mawaalii. It is important to know that the various political entities of the early Islamic period were not centralized states, and many of them allowed, or rather were forced to concede, a large degree of local self-governance, especially in the early history. And many of the caliphates can actually be viewed as a patchwork of various smaller political entities and tribal groups and kingdoms that were allied or subservient to the centralized authority of the caliph, at least in theory. Sometimes in practice they were not at all. These allies of the caliph
had usually agreed to provide troops for various campaigns through various means.
And these allies could even include non-Muslim allies, or allies that were outside of the proper borders of the caliphate, but had allied with the caliphate for various agreements. And one of the reasons as to why certain non-Muslim entities would ally in this way is that it was a way to avoid having to pay taxes, having to pay the jizya, the tax that was imposed upon non-Muslims. However, it's important to know regarding these Mawaalii troops that they were part of various political alliances, and these were usually made personally by the caliph or a proxy of the caliph. And as they were part of various political alliances, these troops had their allegiance to their own lords and rulers, and were under their control and not under the control of the caliph directly, but rather indirectly as an ally. And these allies could have very different goals than what was the goals of the local ruler or caliph. And if a more opportune ally presented themselves, they could very well shift their allegiance. The Umayyads were famous for using Mawaalii troops in their armies as kind of the backbone of their armies, which cost them dearly when their armies turned against them during the Abbasid revolution and they were overthrown, when previously allied groups in Yemen and in the north and Iranian areas of the caliphate turned against them. And speaking about the Abbasid revolution and the Abbasids, there was another system that provided troops and was one of the main sources of troops for much of Arabic history and absolutely reached its zenith during the Abbasid period. And that was the Junudul Hajj with what troops bound to land usufruct. These are troops bound to military service through the use of land belonging to a mosque congregation. These troops got the right for the use of this land and their future descendants' use of the land for farming and to live off the land in exchange for doing military service and paying excess production of farming to the congregation and the leaders of the mosque congregation. When I mentioned volunteers before that fought in the Islamic Armies in order to get rights to land, it was usually this sort of right to a land that I was intending with that, as they would be assigned to the land held by a mosque congregation, and they and their future descendants would have a right to use that land, to live off it. This is actually a kind of serfdom contract between a family and a mosque congregation and its leaders, where the troops and their families get the right to use the waqf or the usufruct of the congregation's lands. These troops are actually quite similar to the serf and peasant levies found in Europe in later times, though much more standardized, as the Sharia, in its various interpretations, actually standardized the practice somewhat. However, it's important to know that these troops were actually bound to the mosque congregation and its leaders and their decisions, and not to the caliph's central authority. And these leaders and mosque congregations might be reluctant to send men that would otherwise tend to the farmland of the mosque congregations and being productive for them. Not to mention that these mosque congregations and their leaders would have to take upon themselves the responsibility and cost of training and arming these troops. And this is very costly, and sometimes for no benefit, as these troops would be sent on campaigns that would see very little benefit for the people sending these troops away. At least not without concessions or compensation from the side of the centralized authority or the caliph. Not to mention that these troops and their mosque congregation employers could very easily rebel if they deemed the ruler to be unjust. And this is a problem for Islamic rulers during this period, as these sort of soldiers were usually the majority of troops present in an Islamic army. They were the majority of the armed forces. And this was especially the case in the heyday of the Abbasid Caliphate. And this, of course, is a challenge to the centralized power of a political entity when the forces are not under their control, and the other sorts of troops, such as the paid permanent troops, are either too costly, them and mercenaries, or they have issues of control, such as mercenaries, volunteers and allied troops. Just like these troops bound to agreements of usufruct. And this became a great issue, especially in the later Abbasid period, as more wars, both from outer enemies and from internal enemies in civil war, caused an increased demand upon troops and the need for troops that were under the direct authority of the centralized ruler, be it a caliph, a sultan or an amir. However, during the middle of the Abbasid period, they kind of found a solution to this. And this might seem crazy, but this is what they did. They created a new class of troops that were called Al-Mawaalii or Mamluuk, which means owned. These troops were slave soldiers. You know, I said before you could not force a free man to fight. Yeah, these were not free men, but slaves. Often these slave soldiers were taken as young kids, especially from Slavic Sakaliba or Turkic Atrak background, from the north of the Islamic world, usually through various intermediaries that sold these people. In any case, these slave soldiers were trained to fight and kill, and to serve their new masters as troops on the battlefield. Some were pretty much just cheap cannon soldiers, and others were very well trained elite troops. However, they had the advantage of not being paid troops in the same way as free men. Thus they were cheaper than regularly paid troops. But most importantly, these slave soldiers could be a good alternative to regularly paid soldiers for the centralized rulers in the various political entities that existed within the Islamic domain, as the rulers could claim to own these people directly. However, as you might have guessed by these soldiers being slaves, the loyalty of these soldiers and thus the control were, well, let's just say there is a reason why the Mamluks of dynasties of Egypt were a thing later. And the Mamluks in Egypt is a case of a successful revolt, where they gained power. There is also the Sanj rebellion during the 9th century, which was a rebellion made by black slaves and was primarily supported by a lot of black slave soldiers who rebelled against the Abbasid Caliphate. This rebellion was eventually put down, but it caused a lot of devastation, and it shows that the loyalty of these slave soldiers and the control over them was not that much better in comparison to other sorts of troops. And now, my viewers, you might wonder, why did this idea ever make sense to the people at the time? Well, to be honest, in the late stages of this Islamic period, due to the lack of easy access to easily controlled military forces, a lot of rulers did not have a lot of other choices than to use slaves as soldiers, as conscription would be very unpopular and very risky, as it was considered forbidden. Also, the people that would be conscripted in order to fight would either be connected to various powerful interests, such as the mosque congregations or local rulers or various other sorts of powerful men, and thus would cause conflict with them, or recruiting from various minority groups or other types of marginalized groups that could potentially take it as an opportunity to rebel, as conscription and sending them into war would mean also arming them for war. And the weapons given to wage war against enemies can quite easily be turned back against the ruler. So there were some feasibility issues here. There's also the fact that the Islamic society during this period was a society that employed mass slavery, with sometimes so much as a third of its population in slavery during the absolute heights of slavery. And slaves were used for all sorts of work, from work in households to work on fields and work in mines and in all sorts of occupations and jobs. And thus it was probably not considered that strange that you adopted this attitude towards slavery even to war and using slaves as soldiers. It was just another work for slaves to do. But still, this led into later stability issues, which I might cover in a later video. But anyway, these are the types of troops that existed. We have a centralized army that consisted of paid permanent professional troops. We have voluntary forces that could swear loyalty to a ruler for a campaign. We have mercenaries. Then we have allied forces. And then we have bound troops to the waqf system. And lastly, slave soldiers. These were the types of troops that made up the armies during this age, from the 7th century to the 13th century. I hope that this video has been informative, and if you have any questions or other comments, please post them, as I love to hear your comments and to interact with you, my viewers. And don't forget to give a like as well if you liked this video. It helps with the algorithm.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.